Já podemos apresentar. Bom, pessoal, de volta, né? Hoje a gente vai começar a discutir aqui a questão da economia, a igualdade, né? A igualdade do desenvolvimento econômico das cidades. Nosso convidado hoje aqui especial é o Edward Glaser, né? Professor de Harvard, vou apresentar. Então, Edward Glaser, I shift to the English. So our guest today here is Edward Glaser. It's an honor to have you here with us today. Personally, it's the work of Edward Glaser is something that I can say I read a lot. It's something that I'm passionate about it. All the books, Triumph of Cities, the new one, The Survival of Cities. It's amazing approach. So I recommend this reading. And also with us here, we have today Laura Miller. It's a research coordinator here and professor at Insper, and Danilo Igliori, the chief economist of ZAP. And today yes, and she's there with us. Okay, and Ana Claudia Rosenbach is not yet has not arrived yet. Okay, so but she's joining us as well to the debate. So I leave the floor for you, Edward Glaser. You're on mute.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. I have had connections with Insper since it was founded, since Claudio Haddad had this vision, and Claudio is a very old and very dear friend. So I'm always happy to be engaged with events at Insper, which is just such a great educational institution in Brazil, and in some sense a model for the rest of the world. Okay, so let's get started. Here we go. From beginning. All right, so I'm going to talk largely in at least beginning with things that come from my joint book, which was very much motivated by the perils that cities face in an age of plague and an age of remote work. And then I will talk a little bit at the end, both about new research of mine specifically on workers in Brazil and on new research of mine on the 15-minute city. So when I gave talks on cities prior to 2020, prior to COVID, I would start with a number of facts about just how important and how successful cities have become in the world today. I think their importance is really illustrated by this figure, which shows the growth of poor world urbanization. So what I've done is I've taken the countries in the world in 1960 and then 50 years later in 2010. I've grouped them based on their income levels. In this case, I have corrected for inflation. So this is income in 2012 dollars. And each bar shows the share of countries in each income level that are more than 1/3 urban. 1/3 was chosen as reflecting a fair amount of urbanization in the country. And what you can see is among those countries that were between 4,000 and 5,000, basically 80% of them were more than 1/3 urban in 1960. And, more were, but around the same number were more than 1/3 urban today. $3,000 to $4,000, similarly, very little change. But if you go down to those countries with less than $1,000 per capita income, you'll see a really massive change, which is that if you look in 1960, what share of countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban? It's a really, that number is a really easy number to remember. The number is 0, right? Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of human history, to be poor was to be rural, right? Poverty and living on farms just went together. Today, more than 40% of countries with less than $1,000 per capita income are more than 1/3 urban. And we see the rise of megacities in places like Karachi and Kinshasa, in places that are both poor and poorly governed. Switch to between $1,000 and $2,000. There in 1960, 20%, only 1 in 5 of the countries in this income category were more than 1/3 urban. Today, 60% are more than 1/3 urban. And so the rise of poor world urbanization is one of the most important phenomena in the world today. Brazil was an early mover, right? Brazil became 50% urban in 1964 when it was a relatively poor place. And it has subsequently, I think, shown the outcomes, the value that actually comes from urbanization. This shows the relationship between urbanization in 1960 and subsequent GDP growth. So as you can see, there's a very strong positive correlation among initially poorer countries between the level of urbanization initially and subsequent growth. I don't take this to mean that we should ever artificially induce urbanization, artificially force people to leave farms and move to cities. But I know of no pathway out of poverty into prosperity that does not run through city streets. And consequently, I think it's incredibly important for governments to allow cities to naturally grow and to focus on the forces that actually make cities' life more difficult, to focus on what I've called the demons of density, the downsides of density, which include traffic congestion, sometimes crime, high housing costs, and of course, contagious disease. When we look within countries or within continents in this case, right, we see a very strong relationship between urbanization, urban density, and income growth. And income levels. So denser places are richer. This is something economists have called agglomeration economies. And what I've taken here is I've taken the 1,114 NUTS 3 regions in Europe, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density levels, because at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. The blue line shows the relationship between per capita GDP and density. And you can see that the densest 10th of Europe's regions have incomes that are 100% higher, that are double the least dense areas in Europe. So really a very significant gap. Some part of this reflects greater education in dense areas. Some part of this reflects other forces which will create productivity in these dense areas that both attract people in and make them more productive. But a significant fraction of it just reflects the fact that we are a social species that gets more productive when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. The red line shows the perhaps slightly more surprising fact, which is the relationship between population growth and density levels. And you can see that the relationship is weaker, but overall, there's faster population growth in places where there is initially less land per capita, right? So whereas at the start of the 19th century, Americans were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans. At the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. Cities are succeeding not just as places of productivity, but also as places of pleasure, right? Dr. Samuel Johnson, the writer of the dictionary in the 18th century, famously opined that when a man is tired of London, he's tired of life, because London has such pleasures that it's hard to imagine where how one could lose interest in all of that. That fact is still true. London is still an amazing consumer city, a place that is enormously pleasant to live in. The downside of that is you have prices that are very, very high, housing prices that are very, very high relative to income levels. This shows the price to income ratio throughout England. And you can see numbers that are significantly above 10 in the region around London and numbers that are under 3 in some areas to the north. Those high prices can't just reflect productivity, right? Because otherwise they would be just tracking income, not going up much faster than income does. They reflect the fact that people are paying for the pleasures of London. They also reflect the fact that it's too difficult to build in London, which is part of the curse of urban unaffordability. Now, a final fact about cities in the developing world is that it's often claimed that cities are productive, but they're unpleasant places that make people miserable. That doesn't appear to be true in the poorest parts of the world. And so what I'm graphing here is the gap between urban and rural happiness. If the dot is positive, it means that people who live in cities say that they're happier than people who live in rural areas. If the dot is negative, people who live in rural areas say that they're happier. In the wealthy parts of the world, there's really no difference. Some places like New Zealand, the rural dwellers are happier. Some places like Sweden, the urbanites say that they're happier. But if you go to our poor countries over here, India, Mali, Ghana, Moldova, South Africa, Rwanda, overwhelmingly, there's a strong tendency of people who live in cities to stay they're happier. So despite the difficulties of Mumbai slum, despite the pain of getting around Kolkata, right, the residents of those urban areas still have more hope, still have more life satisfaction than the people who live in rural India. Now, all of this positive stuff feels very 2019, because in 2020, we had the reappearance of an old companion of urban life. We have had urban plagues for at least 2,400 years, which is when we have the first well-documented urban plague, the plague of Athens, 430 BC. And it's well-documented because Thucydides, one of the two fathers of history who lived in Athens, was there. Now, if you think about the backstory for the plague of Athens, Athens in the 5th century is doing everything you could possibly hope a great city to do. It's enabling connected people to do incredibly creative things, working together, learning from one another, creating breakthroughs in the arts, in drama, in architecture, in sculpture. It becomes an economic powerhouse. It becomes a military powerhouse. And all of that excites the rivalry of its land-based military rival of Sparta. Sparta demands that Athens back down. Pericles, the leader of the Athenian democracy, refuses, and so the Peloponnesian War is on. Now, the cunning plan that Pericles puts together is that the Athenians will come in behind the walls of the city and trust to those walls to keep out the Spartan warriors, and then send forth the superior Athenian fleet to harass the coast around Sparta. Militarily, the strategy works. The walls keep out the hoplites, the fleet is unbeaten on the water. But walls that can keep out enemy soldiers may not be able to keep out a virus or bacteria, and something gets in. Cities are vulnerable to plague for two reasons, and you can see both things at play in Athens. One of which is they are the nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. They are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses. Secondly, they are dense. In those dense enclaves, diseases can move rapidly from people to people. Thucydides describes a city that has gone amok, where people live only for the day because they do not expect to live to see tomorrow. Perhaps one in four of Athens's population dies. The city soldiers on for another quarter century, but in a sense, its glory is dimmed forever, and it never manages to recapture the magic that was true in the years before the plague. Now, Athens, or even worse, the plague of Justinian, almost 1,000 years later, these were very destabilizing events. They were destabilizing because they struck at their societies at times in which they were already weak. For most of the past 650 years, right, our world has been much more resilient to pandemic. The early 19th century was an early era of globalization. It was an early era of plague. This shows the time series of death rates in New York City over the past 200 years. Early 19th century is all about yellow fever. It's a mosquito-borne illness that emerges out of Africa, gets carried over to the Caribbean, and then works its way up to the cities of the Northeast. Then you have cholera, which emerges in a particularly virulent form in the Ganges Delta in India in 1817, travels overland with the English army, travels overland with the Russian army, makes its way to the cities of the West. These are events which are killing not a quarter of the population, but between 2 and 5% of the population when they have these outbreaks. So these are maybe, whereas the plague of Athens is maybe 100 times more virulent, 100 times deadlier than COVID-19, these are 10 to 20 times deadlier than COVID-19. And yet, despite those demographic disasters, they were, the cities were resilient to them. And they were resilient for two reasons, one of which is that poor people were willing to come to cities despite the risk of disease. And the same thing has been true in the developing world during the time of COVID, where, San Francisco offices may still be empty, but there's no sign that we have a decline in visiting workplaces in any of the poor parts of the world. Secondly, the cities of the West rallied and invested in infrastructure like clean water and sewers to protect themselves against their disease. This is in some sense the moment in history in which the governments of the West become agents that actually save people's lives instead of just agents that take lives. This doesn't happen by accident. This happens by spending an enormous amount of money on clean water and sanitation. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as our national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And it required the engagement of ordinary citizens who worked hard to make sure that their government did the right thing. Now, thanks to those investments, urban death rates declined, and it's been a century since we've had a terrible global plague. And then, of course, in April 2020, this happened again. The early days of the plague in the West was highly urban. Again, that's largely because these were ports of entry. And so as of April 2020, COVID-19 was a pandemic that was associated with New York, Boston, Atlanta, New Orleans, Detroit, a little bit in Seattle, right? These were the ports of entry for the disease. But unlike a waterborne pandemic, like cholera, right? An airborne pandemic really can get everywhere. This was the truth with influenza 100 years ago. It's true with cholera. And so by November 2020, the plague was stronger in the Dakotas, in the wild west of the US, than it was in the urban centers. Moreover, within cities, there's no evidence that urban proximity particularly spread the disease, in the sense that people who lived in denser quarters weren't any likelier to get it. This shows a map of Manhattan. This is about May 2020. So this is early on in the pandemic. The light area in the center, this is Manhattan. This is where the buildings are tallest. This is Brooklyn, also a very dense area. These outlying areas are the outer boroughs, which are less dense areas. You can see that the cases are much more prevalent in the places where density is lowest. In the places where people actually live in houses with yards, those were the places that had it most. Why? Because in fact, it wasn't about living quarters, at least in the US, it was about moving about. And here you can see the decline in movement pre and post the outbreak of the pandemic in different parts of New York City. This is a sort of an amazing thing. It's the first time in history that we've been able to actually track how diseases were spread by looking at mobility by cell phone. And you can see there was really a much sharper decline in mobility in the city center than there was on the edges. This, of course, reflects the industries of these areas. This reflects the fact that people in the center were rich workers who were in knowledge-based industries, and those knowledge industries were able to work from home. The workers in the outer boroughs work in urban service industries. They work in necessary industries. They're nurses. They're people who work in pharmacies. They're people who work in grocery stores. To get paid, they needed to come to work. And when they came to work, they got sick. And there's a really strong connection between moving around and getting the illness during this earlier time period. We calculate for every 10% reduction in trips during this time period, there was a 20% reduction in the chance of getting the disease. Now, the connection between education and working from home is just really obvious in the data. As of May 2020, 68.9%, more than 2/3 of Americans with advanced degrees were working from home. Only 5% of high school dropouts were working from home. An enormous education gradient in how you could respond to this, because once again, technology complements education. You can see this in the overall death rates. This looks across America's metropolitan areas and looks at the death rates from COVID-19. And you can see that the death rates in the least educated parts of America were double that of the death rates in the most educated parts of America. I know of no previous plague in which this was remotely true. It is certainly true that during the era of the Black Death, richer people in Europe tried to hide themselves out, like the famous characters of Boccaccio in the Decameron, who fled to the hills of Fiesole to escape the plague. But it doesn't appear they were that successful in doing so. Whereas here, you really do appear to have been much less likely to get the disease if you were educated and able to work from home. Now, one of the reasons I worry about the combination of the disease and working from home in their impact on cities is our cities felt fractured before this event. They felt fractured because, at least in the West, they were bringing productivity but not opportunity. They were becoming permanently unaffordable, partially because they were failing to deliver enough housing. And we were running a policing strategy that was really just kind of stupid and locking up far too many people, as well as killing far too many people. I'll just give you a few graphs on this. This graph just shows the relationship between the amount of building and how expensive it is to buy a home relative to how expensive it is to build a home. And what you can see over here, these are the places that build a lot out here with names like Phoenix and Houston and Atlanta. These places aren't expensive because in places where supply is unconstrained, prices get held down to construction costs. And that's about what you see. This number one means prices are basically at construction costs. In these areas where prices are 2 or 3 times construction costs, these are places that don't build a lot. It just reminds us of the power of supply, that if you're going to make it difficult to build, then you risk creating a city that's not affordable to ordinary people. This is something that Brazil must also think about. We also know that places that are more restrictive, places that have higher levels of upward mobility for kids, and here I've ordered the cities on the basis of their upward mobility for children, those places are the most restrictive in building. So the places where we'd like there to be the most new homes to allow the children of poorer parents to come and find opportunity, those places make it hardest to build. This just shows the rise of people who are incarcerated in the US, the enormous number of people that we've locked up, often for very minor drug crimes. It's really sort of it's a huge national issue in the US. And while it's certainly true that we should have people who are locked up for life, right, it's not true that, we should possibly be locking up so many people. Now, another reason why this plague was something that we felt more vulnerable to me, that felt like we were more vulnerable to, is the evolution of the economy. If you think back historically, right, in an economy of subsistence agriculture, like Europe at the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, right, the impact of the plague is essentially positive on the economic outcomes for the survivors. So the Black Death was a demographic disaster. 1/3 of Europe's population perhaps died. But the people who left experienced enormous wage gains because there was so much demand for labor that it disappeared. There was so much extra land that needed to be taken care of. And so in an agricultural economy where wealth is basically based on the land per person, as the number of people declines, the overall wealth for the survivors goes up. Flash forward to the industrial economy of 1918, 1919 during the influenza pandemic. In that economy, there was a short, sharp recession associated with the influenza pandemic, as the work of Francois Velde of the Chicago Fed documents. But while occasionally mines shut down because workers were too sick, factories occasionally had disruptions in their labor supply as well. Fundamentally, people kept buying Model T Fords, cars. They kept on buying refrigerators. They kept on buying durable goods, just as they did during this pandemic. And so the economy rebooted itself very rapidly. By contrast, this pandemic was very, very strange because over the past 100 years, urban service jobs, the 32 million Americans who worked in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, these were an employment safe haven in an era of automation and outsourcing. And the ability to serve a cappuccino with a smile was an ability provided a job for someone who didn't have a degree in engineering from MIT. All of a sudden, those jobs became a source of peril, both to the customers and to the workers. I had originally thought that the larger problem, this just shows the rise in wages for workers in leisure and hospitality. On the eve of the pandemic, I thought the bigger issue was going to be the lack of demand for these jobs from customers who were afraid of getting the disease while ordering it. Turned out not to be so. The big problem was the absence of workers who didn't want to work and get the disease, quite understandably. And so far from declining during the pandemic, wages shot up, especially in blue states where fear of the pandemic has been more acute. Now, looking forward in wealthy parts of the world, one of the biggest questions is, will we ever go back to work? And it is sort of amazing that we've continued to have such low occupancy rates across so many cities. And this is the Castle Back to Work Barometer, which continues to show that, particularly the most well-educated downtown areas, San Jose, San Francisco, New York, still have 50, 60% of their offices unoccupied. This data comes from the people who check in electronically. This is a company that provides those services. And so this has led people to ask the question, maybe this is not just about plague. Maybe this is just a permanent change in the way that we work, created by this new technology that we're using right now. Now, this is not the first time technologies have impacted cities. Okay, there is a millennia-old dance between cities and technologies, where some technologies are centripetal; they pull us in, like the aqueduct shown here, and some technologies are centrifugal; they push us away from cities, like the automobile here, or radios or TVs. Much of the 20th century was a centrifugal century in the U.S., where we suburbanized, we moved to exurban locations, our factories moved away from urban areas because of cheaper transportation. And so those technological changes killed off urban industry, like the garment industry in New York City, which was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s. Now, the fact that these technological changes, moving goods, had caused the goods producing industries in cities to disappear, led Alvin Toffler, right, this very famous futurist, to speculate in 1980 that information technology of his day, not quite Zoom, but personal computers, fax machines, they would cause knowledge industries, financial services, accounting, law, to leave cities, and would cause knowledge workers just to camp to electronic cottages and just dial it in. Now, sort of amazingly, while he had predicted that this would lead to forests of empty skyscrapers, for 39 of the last 42 years, he has been completely and totally wrong. Right? He's been wrong as, this is the Wallace office at Mike Bloomberg's City Hall in New York. This is the campus of the Googleplex, right? Tech companies did not send workers home before 2020. Google, which could have enabled work from home beforehand, they wanted them right there. They bought 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan. They were betting on cities. They were betting on face-to-face contact because they recognized that their young workers became more productive by being around each other, right? Bloomberg's office is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is based on the Salomon Brothers trading flow program, right? This, in some sense, trading floors are the city writ small, right? why are they there? Why are all these workers next to each other and financial services right on top of each other? Why? Because in their industry, knowledge is more important than space. And that's in some sense what's happened over the past 40 years, is that globalization and new technologies have made knowledge radically more important. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. As the world gets more complicated, it's easier for ideas to get lost in translation. And, the hardest part about teaching is not knowing your subject material, it's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. And we have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension and confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another, as witnessed right now. In fact, prior to COVID, I was mostly worried about the rise of not the future of our cities, which seemed assured, but the rise of primate joblessness in lower density parts of America. This shows the sort of massive economic dysfunction of America's eastern heartland. The fact that great swaths of America have more than 1 in 4 prime-age men don't have jobs, right? Because I thought that in a place like New York City, there would always be a job for a less educated worker doing something in the urban service sectors, but I couldn't imagine what they would do in West Virginia or Tennessee. Now, what do we know about productivity post-pandemic? What do we know about productivity after companies have gone remote? Most of the evidence, which comes from either jobs like call center workers or computer programming, where output can be quantified, most of the evidence seems to suggest that in the short run, productivity is just fine. But there's also evidence in both industries that suggests there are long-run consequences. So both the original path-breaking work of Nick Bloom, who looked at a randomized controlled trial for a Chinese call center, and more recent work by Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, who are 2 former students of ours, shows the same thing, which is a 50% reduction in the probability of being promoted if you go remote. So if you're remote, your workers don't learn how to be a better call center worker, how to handle the really difficult calls, and the bosses don't learn if the workers are good. And so the workers get siloed in the same old jobs. A similar fact seems to be going on in terms of computers, in programmers. This comes from the work of Sonia Jaffe, and I'll just read it for you. Our results show, this is from the
Edward, you are in mute. You still mute. No, yes.
Okay, our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. Moreover, companies stopped hiring new workers for remote jobs. So this is work by Jose Ramon Morales Aria and Carlos Davoin. On the left-hand side are jobs that have to be done live. On the right-hand side are jobs that can be done remotely. You can see for the jobs that have to be done live, there was a big drop in the employment, which is in red, and the postings for new jobs, which are in blue, right at the time of COVID hitting. And then it came back right up. Both of them came back right up. Firms were hiring for live jobs. The employment came back up. By contrast, on the right, these are remotable jobs. These are jobs that don't need to be done live, like being a computer programmer. These jobs, employment stayed steady. You didn't fire your programmers, right? But new hiring for programmers plummeted. Between the beginning and end of 2020, new postings for programmers on Burning Glass dropped by 42%. You can really see that in the data. Firms were not willing to take a risk onboarding new workers because the learning process had been shut down. Now, I tend to think that the long-run impact of Zoom, of this effect, means that talent has become more mobile, that people will find it easier to relocate and maintain connections with their old friends or their old coworkers in distant places. But I don't think it's going to mean the end to downtowns at all. So I think that cities are going to have to compete even more fiercely for talent. But I don't think that this is naturally going to lead to an end to downtowns. In part because prices will adjust, real estate costs will decline, younger firms will replace older firms. Now, look at African Americans who grew up in more segregated cities. They have done much worse in life. And this comes from work, but both older work by David Cutler and myself, and newer work by Raj Shetty and others. Hold on, wait a minute. Okay, so this is our joint work on 15-minute cities. I'll actually cut through the Brazil. The Brazil work relates to this. I'm sorry, I got this slightly backwards. We're working on race data in Brazil. We've been looking at the impact of both city size, which is positive, and on location in the north, in which the cities of the north appear to create much less economic productivity than the cities in the south, and much less upward mobility for poor workers, especially in the private sector. The variable that explains much of that is the fact that the firms in northern Brazilian cities are much less economically integrated. So highly skilled workers work with less skilled workers in companies in southern Brazil, but much less so in northern Brazil. And that actually explains much of the difference, which suggests that, again, segregation, in this case, economic segregation at the company level, is deeply, deeply harmful for workers and learning and productivity. Okay, so this is work with, as I said, Carlo Ratti and many others. We're using data on cell phone trips in America. We're tracking visits to millions of different places. And we're looking at the level of 15-minute access, 15-minute usage. 15-minute access is just asking how many of these points of interest, cafes and so forth, are within 15 minutes. Usage is how much of the trips go on within there. So typically in the US, there's not a lot of 15-minuteness outside of the Eastern Corridor. So urban residents in the Northeast take close to 32% of their trips to basic amenities locally. They take 68% of their trips outside. Southern urban residents take 16% or lower. For the median urbanite in the US, only 12% of trips go to basic amenities. And the New York Metro has the highest usage of walkable amenities, 42%. So it's important to remember that America just looks very different from most European cities in its walkability. Access and usage are very closely correlated. So we have our access measure, number of amenities within 15 minutes access, very highly correlated with each other. Okay, and it's very highly associated with income across metropolitan areas. So this is This is income, which is just showing the extent to which richer people in the richer areas within the U.S. have much less 15-minute usage across different urban areas in the US. Now, we do one more thing here, which is we use, and I think this is an area in which I really do agree with the 15-minute advocates, that we have in many parts of the world, especially in the US with Euclidean zoning, we've actually made 15-minuteness hard to achieve because we've zoned out commercial uses in residential areas, which I think is a terrible mistake. So we're actually able to estimate the impact of access on usage by using the New York City zoning plan of 1961. So the New York City zoning plan determines the amount of floor area of commercial zoning that's in an area. And then we're able to show the extent to which reducing that reduces the usage of trips. So we're essentially using the exogenous variation in access that comes from having less commercial zoning in your area, and just showing that when you use this, you also see this very strong link between access and usage. This is just within New York. Finally, this is the relationship between usage and the level of experience segregation. And so the extent to which low-income people are using, this is this low line, the extent to which low-income people are using things that are within their own 15-minute area, they live much more segregated lives. That's not true for rich areas, right? So rich areas use a lot in 15 minutes, actually makes them slightly less segregated. But we have to be very careful in a country with high levels of poverty to say that we really want to encourage people to do things within their 15-minute area, because that basically means that you're segregating the lives of the poor, and that's exactly what this shows. Finally, I would just end on two final points, which is that I believe that we will get through this, but we have now seen that a plague that starts anywhere can spread anywhere, right? We have a need for a global response that prevents the possibility of future pandemics. We currently have something in the World Health Organization that looks something like the UN and is about as effective as the UN. We need something that is much more muscular and much more like NATO. And so one of the things we push in our book is the idea of a NATO for health, which means something that will monitor disease, preemptively develop vaccines, and engage in a global trade where wealthier countries will invest in the sanitary infrastructure of poor countries in exchange for monitoring of diseases and exchange for enforcing rules that separate humans from the animals that can cause new plagues to spread. And I will just end with these two images of Milan during World War II and today, and just to remind everyone that the cities are incredibly resilient. They have been through much worse than COVID-19. They will survive this just as they have survived that. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ed. It's really, really nice to hear you talk about cities. It's the passion about it. It's amazing. The survival of the city, I think, is quite a reality. Everybody here experienced the COVID time. So we start to analyze that to understand the impact of the cities. The counterpoint here over the 15-minute city. So before we heard something, the concept of that. Now we have another point of view. So I leave the floor for, I think, Ana Claudia is already joining us. I think if you like to present yourself and I talk a little bit about the Edward Glazey presentation, if you have any questions. So I leave the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. It's a little bit echo.
Yes.
Yes. Maybe you can turn off the computer and stay only in your phone.
Yeah, I could try to do that.
Yeah, so no, so
that should be fine now, Professor. I've just put you on a waiting room.
Oh,
So
I'm
the other computer, so it's okay now. Go on.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Ed. Sorry for the tech issues. So thank you, Insper, Tomas, everybody, for the invitation. And thanks for this very interesting presentation, Ed. I had some comments, actually, more focused on the reality of the Global South and thinking about, poverty and vulnerability issues that we face, right? So I don't know if it's right now, if I should extend my comments right now, or if we should listen to others' questions.
No, I think you can.
I can go.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I just want to bring a little bit from the Latin American perspective, because this is my point of view. I'm the director for the Latin American program at Lincoln. So just the bigger picture, what happened here, right? So we had from 1950 to 2018, we had like we moved from 41 to 81% urbanization in the overall Latin American Caribbean region, okay? In the 90s, since the 90s, we stabilized. And one interesting fact is that in the 90s, we grew around 4% and then 3% from 2000 to 2014. These are the same exactly grow rates as Europe had. So this information is shared at the Metropolis Pan American report that was just issued. So my point is, and Shlomo Angel also mentions that 3/4 of cities grow happen outside of the city boundaries, and 60% of the density, and the density is 60% lower. So what's my point here? So Latin America grew more or less same rates in Brazil, more or less same rates as Europe. We follow the same pattern of growing at a lower density rates, right? But what's the difference in our region? And I think this is important to be discussed when we talk about smart cities, when we talk about connection, and when we talk about, what happens post-COVID in our cities. It happens that our growth in Latin America was mostly precarious. It was mostly informal. For example, in Peru, in the last 20 years, 93% of the city's growth was informal, 93%. So this is a lot, right? So right now we have some numbers from UN Habitat that says that 30% of the cities are represented by informal settlements in the region. But we do have a study from the IDB that proves the fact that this information is not accurate. Our census, the information, and I was so, I'm always very amazed when I listen to Americans share about their data. The other day, I heard another scholar from Harvard, Chris Hebert, talking about housing situation in the US. And it's amazing to see, how much statistics is available. Because according to the IDB, we don't know the levels of informality here because our censuses, they're not equipped to understand the situation. So my point here is that eventually we underestimated the precarity and the vulnerability and the levels of informality of our cities. And the post-COVID situation is very alarming. So CEPAL shares the data that after COVID, we had a situation of 11 million people more living in extreme poverty, and we have 17 million more people living in poverty. This is not less. Yesterday, I was just watching a presentation from Diego Alessio from CEPAL, and he says we are facing a very, very strong economic pressure here in the region. And only 0.6% of the GDP is invested in urban, according to CEPAL. So there's a huge mismatch, right? So we are talking about a totally different city. Also what we learned during COVID is that we have from one side, a huge digital gap. So people living in informal settlements, people working informally. Right now, the rate of informal labor in Latin America is 50%. So we have 50% of the population working informally, and we don't know how much is living informally, but it's a lot, right? So, but we saw during COVID that the digital gap is huge. So people couldn't have, access to education. We'll probably have a huge backlash in education in Latin America. I think there are already numbers out there, but it's important to review these numbers and be aware of that because many, many kids were not able to follow, right? And on the other hand, difficulties to access job markets, opportunities, etc., because of the digital gap. But on the other hand, experiences in India, in Mexico, even in Brazil, Argentina, how these communities in informal settlements supported by community-based organizations, supported by NGOs, they were able to use technology to understand what was going on there by COVID and to support local governments and national governments to take measures and monitor what was going on in terms of COVID, right? So I think we have a big challenge here in terms of understanding better the dynamics of informality. First of all, accept that the situation is prevalent, that situation will probably be worse after COVID. We still don't know the impact of COVID, and improve the ways we understand more what's happening in these informal, precarious areas of the cities. Because this is very, very critical in terms of finding a strategy. And just to finalize this first round of comments, and in relation to what you said, the 15-minute city, I completely understand. And right now that I'm living in Boston, I see that completely. But I believe also in the US, there was a pattern of highways, right, being built and a whole strategy of urban segregation. And what I see in Latin America, some interesting innovations. For instance, the mayor of Bogota established a program called Manzanas de Cuidado, which means you need to find, care, a structure of care within, a block or something like that. So within 15 minutes, women especially, right, and communities should be able to access service. But that doesn't mean that they have to be segregated by that we have to have urban strategies to segregate those settlements. On the contrary, so we need to integrate, to find strategies to integrate. And this is another positive legacy from COVID. Because in COVID, we experienced in Mexico, it was very clear in many metropolitan cities in Brazil too, metropolitan areas in Brazil too, that cities came together to frame, different strategies to respond to COVID, connecting better, the use of masks, protecting health workers, especially in Mexico. There was a whole transportation strategy to protect housing health workers. So maybe in the cities of the global south in general, but I speak of Latin America, we could have, a combined strategy of having really services accessible, within walking distance, but also connect more this, understand more what's going on in these areas, what are the needs, make them better connected inside and integrated to the city. So these are my first, round of comments.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing with us. I think, Laura, if you want to talk a little bit about the subject, if you want to make some comments.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here in this important discussion. Congratulations, Edward, for the really interesting presentation. As you may know, my area of research is poverty, especially poverty in Brazil. So my comments are somehow close to those that Ana Cláudia just said. So if we understand, Brazil has a quite big list of social rights. We have education as a social right, living and many others, but we don't have a nice place to live. I don't know exactly how to say the translation of this, but we don't have the right to live in a comfortable and accessible city. So while Edward was saying, I was just thinking about this, maybe something that we should think about, that maybe we have the right to live in a city that is comfortable for the citizens. But still, if you understand our social rights with or without the right to live in a comfortable city, a way to understand the social right is the social right is something that we can afford, that we can buy. For example, if the state doesn't provide education, we can buy education somehow. We have the private schools, for example. So if you agree with this definition, in the end of the day, the social rights, they all can be bought in somehow. If we have enough money, we will have all our social rights attended. So what we're seeing in the moment in Brazil is that poverty is rising in the cities, but we also have a lot of evidence that maybe the reason of this is that our public policy to include in the labor market, in our public policy for rural areas, for not the urban areas, they are more effective than our public policy to include, to work people that live in the cities. So in the end of the day, maybe something that is quite correlated with what Edward was saying is that we are not being able to have good public policy to work in the cities. Of course, we still have the problems with the quality of the houses and transportation questions. But if we could, if you understand Brazilian problems, the poverty in Brazil in this way, maybe this has a high correlation with the problem of the smart cities. São Paulo, for example, before the pandemic, we had 3% of the people that live in São Paulo, the city, under the line of poverty, and now we have almost 12% of the people living in São Paulo that doesn't have 210 reais per month. So I don't know if we have a problem. And in the other hand, people that live in the countryside, they didn't experience the same problem. So poverty in the countryside in Brazil is not growing. Actually, they are in the same level. So maybe besides the problem of the smart cities, that is not my area of research, we also have something that is totally related, that is our problem with our public policy to poverty that are not enough. They are not being successful in the big cities, especially. And we can see this in São Paulo city. We can, I think everybody here saw the number of people that lives in the streets, and in Los Angeles as well. I saw some videos last week. We have been this really difficult problem growing, and we don't have this problem in the countryside, for example. So the question that I have been asking myself is that, do we have a public policy to poverty that works in the urban areas, or we have other problems? So I don't know if I'm making a comment or more a provocation. So that's what I wanted to say.
Really nice. I think here you have the mention of the book of Edward Glaser. They talk about Plato, that in society we have two cities, one rich and one poor, and those they will fight to each other. That was reality. So and provoking that like that, you saw here about the informal city. 50% of the informal cities that we have here in South America, in the south of the globe. And the question is, because we have two different realities. One of them, for example, is the work from home. It's reality for part of the population. It's really reality for some people, some of us here. And in the other line, in the other line, you have no one working on that. So, but how can we afford this kind of two societies and try to address the same policies for the two different societies that live at the same city? And I'm just simplifying here about two. So I don't know if here, Daniel, if you want to make some comments, and then we leave the place here for Ed to try to summarize everything and answer that quite fast, because I know that you have a little time up.
Right. So I guess Professor Glaser has a lot to comment on already. I'm going to just add two quick questions. Right. The first one has to do with the impact of work from home or remote work in the shape of cities. Right. I certainly agree that what we're going to see in the future is once again evidence of the resilience of cities to this kind of plagues or pandemic. But every time that we have technological shocks or technological change, or in this particular case, changing the usage of technology that were already available to the population, we see changes in the shape, in the way cities operate. So even if the cities survive in the long run after the COVID pandemic, what sort of change we can imagine that would take place in the after the pandemic? And the second question is, it's just to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on your critique of the 15-minute city, because you focus on the segregation effect. But knowing a bit of your work myself, right, I would imagine that behind the critique is something a bit more general, which has to do with agglomeration economies, right? So basically, if you are breaking up a large metropolitan urban area into small blocks, right, you're giving up of a lot of agglomeration economies that would there in the first place. So perhaps there is something to do with the opposition between place-based policies and people-based policies that you talk a lot in your work. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on that as well. Thank you.
So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thank you for all those wonderful and important comments. So I tried to start my presentation by recognizing the dramatic changes in the global South in urbanization. I mean, that was my first slide, because I do think, in fact, the most important things that are happening in cities are happening in the global South, and the most important things that are happening in the global South are happening in cities. And too often, the effort of urban economists has been focused just on wealthy countries and not on the cities of poorer places. Some of the phenomena are the same. Agglomeration economies work in pretty much everywhere, or at least they work in places in which people are connected to each other, as your last comment suggested. But there are things that are very different in North and South as well. Unfortunately, one of the things, of course, that COVID has done is it's derailed my tendency to spend a lot of time in places like Brazil and South Africa. And so our book, which was written in 6 months in sitting at home, was of necessity very focused on the last book was focused on US problems much more than on the developing world. And the problems really are different. I mean, the economic ravages which have come in parts of Brazil and in South Africa and other areas from COVID have not been experienced in the same way in the US, in part because we have engaged in federal spending on a level that has really not been seen since World War II in terms of the size of the economy. Now, we are already paying a price for that in terms of inflation, and we may well pay a very large recessionary price for that to come. But at least while the pandemic was going on, Americans were flush with cash that had been handed out. And I caution that while there is something to do with poverty and homelessness in LA, I would not consider these similar phenomena, right? Typically poverty, particularly homelessness in developing world cities, is actually just a manifestation of straight up poverty. It's part of poverty. In California, it's a phenomenon that's much more wrapped together with mental health and related to a specific dysfunction of California housing markets, both of which are going together. And it is not fixed by simple anti-poverty programs where, the right thing to do against, I believe, against homelessness in Sao Paulo is much more likely to be fighting poverty straight on and having a broader set of policies that are fighting against poverty. Let me turn specifically to the 15-minute question. I think both the last question that was added and Anna Claudia's remarks, in which I think I agree with both of the thrusts. There is a sense in which there are aspects of the 15-minute city movement with which I strongly agree, right? The idea that we're going to have walkable services, let's say related to public health in poorer neighborhoods, for sure. And I believe that in both the US and in Brazil, but that is about access to basic healthcare services. That's not about saying, oh, you can live your entire life in this tiny cocoon of this area. That's horrible to me. That's essentially, as your comment just suggested, it's saying, let's fracture the city. Let's break it up. Let's tear it down. That's not a good idea at all. That's a terrible idea. But let's actually think about, so let's not call this 15-minuteness. Let's call this, I want to enhance access for poorer neighborhoods to have access to basic services that can enable them to have a better quality of life. I am totally in favor of access to those things. And in the same level, I don't care at all about whether or not, highly wealthy neighborhoods have access to more cafes or not, really. Yes, I'm against excess zoning in those places too, but it's not a high priority for me one way or the other. I do think more generally that we do want to eliminate the barriers that enable entrepreneurs to find their future, whether or not those are regulatory barriers on land use or regulatory barriers on starting a business. And certainly it's sort of an outrage that in the US, and I think in many poorer countries as well, certainly in South Africa, right, we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich, which tends to be in cyberspace, much more lightly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor, which tends to be live. And so because, starting a live business is just something that needs a much larger regulatory hoop, that's an added form of inequality. And I just want to end by commenting on the recognition that the COVID has, like, the negative effects that I expected in the face-to-face service industries, the lack of demand, the breakdown of demand for urban services, which didn't really materialize in the US, really have come full blown to the cities of the developing world, right? Those urban service sector jobs were the jobs that disappeared, right, when COVID happened. And that means that this is a real crisis, and one that reinforces the need to make sure that this pandemic doesn't happen again, that we're protected against it. It is a slightly different thing. I think those jobs will eventually come back as the fears of the disease disappear, and as people start coming back to the offices, as the educated knowledge workers start coming back to the offices. But we need to make sure that we're, continuing to keep our eye on the long haul, on the long game, which is both about making sure that Sao Paulo is a functional place to work if you're a knowledge worker, that you actually want to come here, and we need to continue to fight to do that. But at the same time, and even more importantly, that it's a place of opportunity for the poor. And this means both about the sort of long run investments, which are critical for poorer Brazilians, And that's, above all education, but there are other things as well. And it's also about dealing with these downsides of density, dealing with, traffic congestion, enabling there to be public transportation that enables people to get around more easily, making sure that housing is remotely affordable, dealing with crime levels in various areas. The fight to make the cities of the developing world livable is one of the great vocations of the 21st century. And we must never shy away from that. And I look forward to embracing it. In a sense, that's been the call of all of these conversations. And I embrace that mission, and I hope that this dialogue will continue. So I have to run now, but thank you all. And it's been great to be with you.
Thank you very much. So I think that, and if you want to make a comment to close that, and then we still have open for questions, and we discussed a little bit because today was quite overwhelmed. Huh? We had a lot of things to talk about, but I think that if you want to switch to Portuguese, it's okay.
Ok, então tá bom. Não, só queria comentar, Cecília, né? Seu nome? Comentar o que a Cecília falou. Eu tive faz 2 semanas num fórum sobre habitação do BID em Washington, e uma apresentação do professor Chris Herbert de Harvard, e com vários ministros, enfim, representantes da América Latina inteira. E eu achei muito interessante, todos se identificaram, houve um consenso geral. A apresentação dele mostra claramente as brechas, né, o gap entre a renda dos domicílios das pessoas e o preço das habitações, né, por vários motivos aí flutuando nos Estados Unidos. E é uma situação que eu acho que a gente está enfrentando, né, na América Latina, no Brasil especificamente, e também em vários países da América Latina. Então aí eu vejo Cecília, um aspecto que é bastante similar, né? Nós temos
Laura.
A
Laura, desculpa, Ana.
A Laura, desculpa. Eu falei Cecília, desculpa, Laura, mas eu acho que a gente tem uma questão bastante similar aí. O que dificulta o acesso à habitação e acaba gerando, né, esses meios de habitação que são mais vulneráveis, né? Eu não consigo te escutar, Laura.
Você me ouve bem?
Agora sim.
Agora sim. Bom, eu confesso que eu nunca, como eu falei para vocês, né, minha dedicação é tudo em cima de política de superação da pobreza, né, não específica de habitação, mas essas coisas são muito relacionadas, em especial quando a gente está falando de grandes cidades, né. As evidências que eu conheço sobre o assunto, elas vão todas na linha de que, na verdade, a gente não consegue mensurar o valor dos preços de aluguéis e habitação pelo simples fato que, como foi colocado, né, 60%, 40% dos nossos trabalhadores são informais e vivem em lugares onde a gente não tem acesso ao preço daquele aluguel. Então, por exemplo, todo mundo que mora em comunidades ou em aluguéis, a gente não consegue visualizar. Então, o que a gente está mensurando em termos de evidência, né, o que a gente consegue visualizar como valor de aluguel, né, tende a ser os aluguéis mais caros, pelo simples fato de que são os aluguéis que a gente consegue enxergar via dados, né? E essas informações são imperfeitas. Eu não estou dizendo que isso não é um fenômeno, eu imagino que isso seja um fenômeno porque, né, com anedota é visível, você anda pela cidade, é visível, mas eu acho que todas essas informações, elas acabam sendo difíceis de, vou dizer assim, fazer uma discussão científica forte sobre elas, porque a gente não tem informação, né? E o mesmo vale para a qualidade das moradias. O que a gente tem acesso dos déficits de moradia também sofre do mesmo mal, né? Então, pensando assim, eu imagino que um avanço científico importante para pensar o problema da habitação, ele seja o passo zero, que é a gente conseguir saber os valores de aluguel, né? Eu acabei de sair do governo, eu estava no governo neste ano, e conversava intensamente com a secretária de habitação, e assim, um exemplo, a gente tinha uma discussão muito forte lá sobre se política habitacional ela é uma política de aquisição de casas ou ela é um serviço. eu, como da perspectiva da pobreza, estava implorando para ele fazer uma política de serviço, no sentido de concede um vale-aluguel que é mais rápido, porque se for fazer uma política de habitação que as pessoas vão comprar habitação, no mundo inteiro as pessoas demoram a vida toda para comprar o seu imóvel próprio, né? Então, assim, se você perguntar para o mundo inteiro, para os países pobres, então, meu Deus, as pessoas demoram, às vezes elas morrem antes de ter terminado de pagar. Então, eu estava defendendo para ser mais ágil, pelo argumento era agilidade. Vamos resolver o problema de quem está em extrema com política habitacional como um serviço via um auxílio aluguel. Eu acho que isso ia ser mais rápido para a cidade de São Paulo, em especial, que eram os problemas que a gente estava discutindo. Só que aí ele me respondeu assim, olha, eu acho que é um bom caminho pelo simples fato de que aí eu não preciso... Porque daí o pessoal queria que a gente fizesse contratação desses aluguéis para ter certeza que o dinheiro ia ser usado para aluguel e não para outra coisa. Aí, só que é impossível, porque a maior parte dos aluguéis contratados, as casas onde as pessoas moram no Brasil, na verdade, não tem nenhum contrato, não tem informação, não tem regulamentação, não tem seguro, não tem nada. Então, a gente não sabe o tamanho. A verdade é que a gente vê, é óbvio, eu não discordo, mas a gente não sabe o tamanho do déficit de moradia, a gente não sabe o real problema do quanto de renda falta para que as pessoas tenham acesso a isso, quanto que é um problema do preço do aluguel, quanto é um problema da distância do aluguel que elas conseguem pagar. Então, a gente está um pouco cego na minha leitura, né? Assim, do ponto de vista baseado em evidência sólida, a gente, infelizmente, queria fazer um pedido para o IBGE, mandar um e-mail. Quem sabe, se a gente mandar um e-mail todo mundo junto aqui, por favor, né, resolvam este problema, não sei.
Bom, agora eu preciso fazer um mini comentário, pelo amor de Deus. Tem tempo para um mini comentário aqui?
Tem sim.
Então, vamos lá. Só uma coisa, Laura, duas coisas. O programa de voucher aluguel, eu trabalhei na Prefeitura de São Paulo faz 18 anos, 20 anos, basicamente, e nós desenhamos um programa de Bolsa Aluguel, justamente nessa perspectiva, que hoje tem, acho que 30 mil pessoas morando, etc. e tal, né? Isso é um aspecto. O outro, mas concordo com você, que teria que estar melhor desenhado, né, para ser mais, por questões de monitoramento, por questões de juntar o apoio social, etc., né? Mas isso é uma estratégia que São Paulo já desenvolveu lá atrás, né? Que a gente precisaria, e que vários países na América Latina estão querendo desenvolver, né? E estão procurando, e a gente não tem solução na América Latina, fora o Chile. O Chile é o único país que conseguiu desenvolver uma política de aluguel social mais estruturada, mais contínua. Todos os outros países exploram, fazem coisas pilotos aqui e ali, mas não conseguem fazer nada estruturado. O segundo ponto é que entre 2006 e 2008 foi elaborado a nível federal, no Ministério das Cidades, o Plano Nacional de Habitação. Esse Plano Nacional de Habitação contém vários estudos com projeções de crescimento demográfico, já estimando mudança de renda, de composição de domicílio, estimativas de liquidez do FGTS e do SBPE. Né, isso foi feito, né, isso foi um trabalho intenso, demorou 2 anos para ser feito, muita consulta na sociedade civil, né, e toda uma estratégia desenhada. O programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, que produziu 5 milhões de casas, combinado com o PAC, que chegou a 2 milhões de domicílios, né, fizeram parte de uma grande estratégia nacional para melhorar as condições de vida das pessoas, né, com base nas informações que estavam disponíveis, com todas as imperfeições. Inclusive, Laura, houve uma mudança metodológica no IBGE, houve um esforço muito grande do Ministério das Cidades trabalhando com o IBGE, onde se mudou a metodologia de coleta de dados de informal. Então, hoje o IBGE, no Brasil, tem uma das metodologias mais avançadas no mundo para coletar dado informal. O IBGE liderou uma comissão internacional, né, compartilhando o seu conhecimento com outros países, porque hoje o IBGE trabalha se associando com municípios para identificar os perímetros, né, que são subnormais para poder fazer toda a coleta. Então, nós avançamos sim muito e nós temos as ferramentas. O que nos falta é dar continuidade ao desenvolvimento, né, desses planos, né, a revisão desses planos, né, compartilhar essa massa crítica com a sociedade. Então, isso nós paramos num determinado momento, mas nós temos toda a capacidade de voltar a fazer, né, e de usar esses instrumentos que nós temos para melhorar as informações, né, e inclusive financiar mais pesquisas. É o Danilo que está aí, né? O Danilo já fez pesquisa com relação a isso, a Silvia Schor fez pesquisas antigamente, o Pedro Abramo faz no Rio de Janeiro. Então, nós poderíamos ter recursos estruturados de pesquisa para compreender melhor, e a metodologia a gente já tem, né? Como funcionam esses mercados informais. Mas, desculpa, eu tinha que fazer esse comentário.
Oh, legal. Eu acho que eu vou... Primeiro, assim, acho que o tema da política habitacional é muito maior do que o escopo dessa nossa conversa aqui, né? Então, eu fico meio, acho que um pouco no meio do caminho entre o que a Laura e a Ana Cláudia falaram, porque assim, falta muito dado, acho que ainda falta muito dado, né? Aqui, junto com o Insper e muitos dos economistas e o próprio Lincoln, nós né, dedicamos muito tempo do nosso trabalho para produção e análise de dados. Então, claro, eu estava conversando com o Washington Fajardo, que fez um trabalho interessante no MIT para tentar documentar informações de favelas, usando mais tecnologia e tal. Mas tem muita coisa, é verdade, né? Porque a Ana Cláudia estava dizendo, já tem muito tempo de trabalho sobre informalidade no Brasil, né? Inclusive, a gente sabe tem muita informação sobre relação de aluguel nas favelas e aluguel popular fora das favelas, né? E ainda que anedótica, não com o grau de qualidade que a gente gostaria, de cobertura que a gente gostaria, tem coisas surpreendentes, do tipo, aluguel informal é mais caro do que um aluguel num barraco, numa favela, mais caro do que um aluguel de um uma kitnet no centro da cidade de São Paulo, né? Então, eu acho que assim, tem muita informação que é menos utilizada do que deveria, na verdade. Aí eu reforço o que a Ana Cláudia falou, acho que a gente tem que priorizar esse tipo de pesquisa, né? Que vale também para questões ambientais, né? Acho que assim, motivar recursos para que a gente dê continuidade nesses trabalhos. Agora, com relação à política habitacional, assim, por mais que tenham sido feitos avanços, acho que ainda tem muito a ser trabalhado, né? Porque é isso, você tem um nível nacional de política habitacional, né? Você tem o nível estadual, você tem o nível municipal, pode pensar em vários né, graus de geografia da política habitacional que não podem ser desprezados. Tem muito mais complexidade nisso do que a gente... para quem não está perto desse tema, imagina. Então, só para dar um aperitivo das coisas, né? Você imagina o seguinte, do ponto de vista da economia, né, por maior que seja uma cidade, a gente pensa nela como uma economia pequena e aberta, né? Ou seja, as pessoas e o capital entram e saem facilmente, né? O termo que a gente usa assim, informal é as pessoas votam com o seu pé, né? Então, migração é um fenômeno muito importante. E, de novo, migração pode ser a migração do Nordeste para São Paulo, mas pode ser a migração entre bairros, pode ser a migração de uma comunidade, de uma favela para o centro da cidade. E esses fluxos, entender esses fluxos são muito importantes. Por que eu estou falando isso? Se você melhora a situação num lugar, né, as pessoas começam a migrar para lá. E, eventualmente, aquela solução que foi desenhada sem antecipar esses fluxos migratórios pode ex ante ser boa, ex post não ser tão boa, né? Então, para citar aqui uma urbanista que eu gosto muito, que é a Regina Meyer, né? Ela sempre chama atenção, da FAUSP, ela sempre chama atenção para isso, quer dizer, pensar em questões metropolitanas nem sempre está presente no desenho de política pública. Aluguel social em particular, né? Eu sou um enorme fã de pensar em aluguéis, porque muito tempo na Inglaterra, ela tem uma experiência bastante interessante, né, com aluguel, não livre de problemas, não livre de controvérsias. Acho que já fizemos alguns movimentos no Brasil, mas ainda muito tímidos. Agora, não vai ser só aluguel também. Vai ter que ter uma combinação entre produção de habitação popular e formas diferentes de aluguel social para a gente ter alguma coisa que seja de fato eficiente. E aí, meu último comentário é um pouco a história da cidade dos 15 minutos, né? Eu quando o Tomás me disse que o Glaser é muito contra, né, ou até um crítico da abordagem, eu de cara achei que ele ia contar uma história de perda de economias de aglomeração, né? Então, o Glaser é um grande, né, advogado, né, o mais famoso não advogado, um economista, mas que divulga, né, a ideia de economias de aglomeração mais famoso, e acho que tem aí um trade-off importante, né? Você começa a segmentar a cidade, eu vou perder alguma coisa. Acho que vamos ganhar outras coisas também, né? Eu não sou tão crítico que nem ele. Agora, a história da segregação, eu acho que é uma coisa muito importante para a gente pensar aqui no contexto de política habitacional, né? E aí, Ana Cláudia, acho que assim, o que está na minha cabeça é o programa do Moving to Opportunity, né? Que aí conecta um pouco com o que a Laura, o velho programa nos Estados Unidos, né, no começo da no meio da década de 90, e que produziu efeitos muito interessantes e que, na verdade, não só dá o voucher do aluguel, mas faz a pessoa com menor renda, dá condição para a pessoa com menor renda viver num bairro de maior renda, né? Eu acho que esse tipo de iniciativa, seja com voucher, seja com zoneamento, obrigando a produção de habitação popular em bairros mais ricos, tem coisas interessantes para serem exploradas que a gente ainda não explorou.
Bom, pessoal, acho que a gente vai... a gente vai fazer o seguinte, eu vou fechar o evento, no sentido, porque a gente ainda está passando a live no YouTube, a gente ainda está acontecendo, então a gente vai fechar aqui o evento. A gente vai fazer um fechamento do todo, porque hoje foi um dia bastante intenso, então a gente vai sentar aqui para discutir um pouco do todo, para falar, porque eu acho que tem muita coisa interessante, né? A gente fala da fronteira social, que hoje a gente não conhece onde está a fronteira do município, a gente ainda continua trabalhando com a fronteira administrativa, né? A gente esqueceu que a fronteira social não necessariamente está ligada àquela linha que a gente desenha no mapa, né? Então, a gente tem um trabalho aqui no Insper que está acontecendo nesse sentido hoje, a gente está tentando levantar isso aí com alguns parceiros. Acho que essa questão da migração é outro ponto importante, porque a gente migra porque a gente não está satisfeito, não necessariamente, né? Às vezes você tem oportunidade e a gente esquece do território que foi migrar, a gente sempre pensa na origem, a gente esquece do destino, né? Então, a gente, como economista, a gente acaba esquecendo esse dinamismo, né? A gente pensa sempre no equilíbrio, mas a gente esquece que do outro lado houve um desequilíbrio. Então, acho que é importante trazer isso para a gente. Falar de desigualdade na cidade, vocês viram que é interessante, né? Porque a gente falou de tanta coisa, da cidade dos 15 minutos, né? Do conceito da segregação, do problema habitacional, do problema de produção, né? Das duas sociedades que a gente vive aqui. Então, acho que eu queria agradecer de novo a participação de vocês. Acho que a gente vai voltar para tentar voltar com esse debate, porque foi intenso, mas foi curto, intenso, né? Mas acho que a gente tem, né, bastante coisa para discutir. Acho que eu agradecer a presença de vocês de novo. Então a gente fecha por aqui, agradeço, né, mais uma vez, e a gente senta para conversar, tá bom? Obrigado, Ana.
Obrigada, tchau, tchau, um abraço aí para vocês, até mais.